I feel very lucky to be here to introduce my friend Mary Rose Somarriba, from whom I've learned a lot about the sex industry and pornography and things over the years. Most recently in some of the pieces which many of you may have read in Verily magazine, dealing with the movie Don John and this sort of thing. But her expertise is far beyond her role even there, though it's quite an amazing one, actually. Mary Rose is the culture editor of Verily magazine, and she's the 2012 Robert Novak Journalism Fellow. She was formerly the managing editor of the monthly magazine First Things and the quarterly journal The New Atlantis. She's written articles and organized events on women's issues and for several publications and organizations, including the Ethics and Public Policy Center, the Public Discourse, the Human Life Review, Acculturated, the Catholic Information Center in DC. And in 2009, Mary was awarded the Susan B. Anthony List Young Leader Award for young women who embody the pro-life legacy of Susan B. Anthony, and was profiled in the Our Sunday Visitor cover story, Young Voices for the Voiceless. She also serves as managing editor for Alt Catholica, which is a web magazine on faith and gender. She and I went back and forth on the title of her talk today, which I'd like to make a correction in the program. It shouldn't read the lighter side of the sex industry. That was meant to be used ironically because there is no lighter side, there is no light side of the sex industry, even though there are many aspects of it that our culture commonly holds to be no big deal. And Mary Rose is here to explain that, in fact, those parts of the industry are not no big deal, and they're actually part of a very tangled web that the sex industry does weave that harms its participants, its viewers, and those just in the culture trying to form healthy relationships, even independent of anything that seems directly related. So without further ado, please join me in thanking Mary Rose for being here and welcoming her.
So as Caitlin was mentioning about the title of the program, Lighter Sides of the Sex Industry, somewhere in there is a parable against smartphones, reading emails at 3 a.m. and thinking you replied about the title of your remarks, and in fact you hadn't. The idea behind this title, The Lighter Sides of the Sex Industry, that's on your programs, is that the porn and stripping, like she said, are considered lighter sides of the sex industry. People partake in them, they're considered legal, people do this on Bachelor Part, all these things, and nobody's like, oh my goodness, sounds like you're doing very explicit activities that are illegal. But in fact, they aren't very light if you look a little closer. So that's why on the website and on this video and elsewhere, we've retitled it to be the Tangled Web of the sex industry. It really is tangled, and it's hard to delineate when you look closely where something legal begins and where something illegal begins. Where something that seems acceptable morally to some people turns into something that's actually very gravely immoral. Where something that appears to be a free choice of somebody turns out, in fact, to be not a free choice, but coercion. So, but let's pretend. Pretend I'm going to tell you about the lighter sides of the sex industry. If I were to do that, here would be my remarks. The porn is a booming business in this country. It helps the economy. It's a reflection of free speech and freedom of expression. It's done great things for the careers of different people, like Kim Kardashian and Paris Hilton, and others who might have not had the spike in their popularity and their personal celebrity status if it weren't for their sex tapes. I don't know if everyone knows, Kim Kardashian actually made money off of her leaked sex tape from Vivid Entertainment. So some of these people have made some good careers out of it. And what else? Porn is shown on college campuses as an educational tool sometimes. It's available for download in very nice hotels. It can add spice to relationships that are getting boring. Just like stripping, strip clubs, people can go there if they have boring sex lives. It adds a lot of light things to people's lives. And that is the end of the talk on the lighter side of the sex industry, because the entire sex industry is not light. It's got a lot of darkness in there. And it's entangled. Pornography and stripping are entangled with forced prostitution and countless abuses. So in that way, the lighter side doesn't exist. It's like saying there's a lighter side of child abuse, and we know there isn't. And I'm here to tell you a little bit more about what should be a huge stain on the porn industry, on the sex industry, if people pay attention to it. These are the connections with sex trafficking. So I'm going to give you a little sense of where I'm going. In this talk, we're going to start with what is the problem? It's commonly misunderstood. So what is the problem? How long has this been happening? Why don't we hear about it? How it affects us, and what we can do about it. So first, to help illustrate the problem, I'll start with a story of one young woman who I spoke to during the course of this fellowship on journalism fellowship, was Jessica Richardson. She was involved in the sex industry for years and had finally gotten herself out, gotten herself on her feet, had a good job, a place in her community, and a family. And randomly one day, some man cocks his head at her and says, "I remember you. You wore red, didn't you?" And first she thought, who, what, perfect stranger? And then she realized that this man remembers her face from Pornography when she was trafficked and was taken, pictures were taken of her while she was trafficked and put online. She told me it sent her into a horrible spiral and that there's some added humiliation. Even though she had buried underneath, buried and tried to move on from the humiliation of being prostituted out, forced to have sex with people, she thinks there's an added humiliation for the fact that those pictures still exist online and she can continue to be violated today, exploited today on the internet. There's the staying power of the internet content. But the truth is, Richardson was trafficked against her will by people for whom porn and prostitution share a common goal: money. And so this problem of domestic human trafficking, it's a national scourge. It's only beginning to command attention. Americans assume often that this black market couldn't exist, only exist beyond our borders in economically devastated countries, but it does happen here. And in fact, there are 100,000, estimated 100,000 youths every year trafficked. And that number has been ranged from 100,000 to 300,000. It's really hard to actually get numbers on a black market, but these are really devastating figures. The U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 defines sex trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, any sex act on account of which anything of value is given or received by any person. In America, it's rare that somebody's just snatched off the street and exploited. Instead, exploitation starts at birth. Abuse starts very early in one's life. Years of trauma usually lead up to it and lay the groundwork for someone to come into their lives later and fulfill a need, hooks them into trusting the wrong person, the trafficker. This person, the trafficker, usually comes in the form of a pimp. Again, what does a pimp make you think of? It probably makes you think of some comical character in society of a pimp and a hoe, and these things are referenced all throughout pop culture without any grim, nobody thinks that these are horrible things, that this is like a very serious exploitation going on when you talk about a pimp, but in reality, there's somebody who controls and abuses several women and profits from making them perform sexual services for buyers. And like sex offenders who prey on youth, pimps are skilled manipulators with an eye for targeting the vulnerable, those who lack parental support, or those who've been previously abused. These factors increase their chances of being able to break a girl down through sustained abuse and mold her into a profitable commodity. The manipulation can be so powerful, it's common for girls to suffer from a form of Stockholm Syndrome, a traumatic bonding with their abusers. So and this is exactly what happened to Jessica Richardson. She was pursued at age 17 by a 45-year-old seasoned pimp who manipulated her into feeling connected to him. And then ultimately, he encouraged her to make a choice. After a sexual relationship between the two of them developed, he said, well, if we're already having sex, why don't you do it for money? Many pimps also suggest, like all of a sudden, they'll have a relationship, they'll feign a loving relationship, then they'll say they have a financial need. Oh, can you help me just this once? And then it becomes quite different. Richardson, like I said, was one of many American juveniles trafficked each year. Ernie Allen of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is the one who says the number can range as high as 300,000. And I mentioned the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. This is important because that includes people like Jessica Richardson when she went off the map at age 17. Now granted, 1 year later she was 18, and people could say, well, she's an adult. But she was exploited before she was 18, and she was lured into this. And so even if people say, well, she's over 18, she's 19, she was continued to be trafficked into her adulthood. That made it no less coerced. So what do we do if somebody sees Jessica Richardson online in their porn habit online? Is it their fault? They don't know that she's trafficked, right? She says she understands if a man doesn't know the difference between a 14 and 18-year-old online, but in the course of her work, helping traffic victims and researching pornography, she's observed that a lot of girls online that are billed as 18 couldn't have been a day over 14. And I asked several other people in the course of this research and if they encountered pornography in their trafficking. And for instance, Tina Front of the Sex Trafficking Survivor Shelter in Washington, D.C., Courtney's house, says all of them, all of those who she's helped have in some way or another had pornographic photos taken of them. So it's a problem. There's no way of knowing on the web. There's no way of knowing. And we no longer have, as you can see, we're starting to see how there isn't as much moral acceptability. There isn't as much, you're in the clear if it's pornography. That's clearly somebody doing legitimate work. We're not so sure, and there's no way to know what's on, there's no ingredient label. There's no, what's this person's name, age, and where are they from? And there's nothing like that with pornography. So therein is the problem of not knowing how to combat this problem as well. Authorities can easily miss the complexity of the problem when they they'll often encounter the prostitution rings and this and that, and they'll arrest prostitutes. These women who have, many of them, been trafficked. It's very hard for them to, from a strictly legal perspective, know whether somebody's a consenting adult or not. Many of these girls are very immersed in a manipulative relationship, and they lie about their age instinctively at this point. They lie about all sorts of things, and they're being abused. So it takes a lot of work, but there thankfully are a lot of women's organizations that have grown, that have sprouted up, many of them led by trafficking survivors who help to really get to the bottom of the problem. And as one investigator told me, they help mine the leads. They can see through what others can't see. What on the face of something could look like. This woman is soliciting sex of men, and that is illegal in this country. But in reality, is there somebody controlling her? But just to give you a little more of a sketch of how stripping and pornography also are mixed up and entangled with the forced prostitution. One woman is just known as FV for female victim in a 2004 indictment. U.S. versus Bagley, had 8 years of being trafficked. She was forced to dance at strip clubs, and she was also posing in pornographic spreads published by Hustler magazine. These things, Hustler magazine, if you see that in somebody's college dorm, nobody's going to say, you're supporting something where a woman was tortured. This woman was tortured, and she was forced into photography that was published in a mainstream magazine. And so we have to realize these are things that are coming to the surface. How much of this is under the surface, remains under the surface? It just becomes more and more clear that this industry, the sex industry, is very, very dark and dirty, and it's almost impossible to get to the bottom of it. But she only was discovered when her traffickers brought her to a state of cardiac arrest during one of their torture sessions, and the federal investigators got involved. Another note is the Center for Impact Research in Chicago. It's a center that was focused on poverty research. It's now defunct due to lack of funding. But they found in 2002 that 54% of women who began in street prostitution move on to escort services, exotic dancing, pornography, and parties. These things that may be more likely to be considered lighter sides of the sex industry. So I hope that gives you a scope of the problem we're talking about. How long has this been taking place? You may ask. Sadly, it appears to be taking place from the beginning. We know that pornography and trafficking have been there since the earliest days of porn becoming mainstream in America. Here's where the story of Linda Lovelace, I don't know how many of you have seen the film that just came out over the summer on Linda Lovelace called Lovelace. It's the story of how Linda Marciano got her fame in America through the film Deep Throat in 1972. Believe it or not, that film was in theaters. People went to see it in theaters. So you could say porn was really booming in this country. It was considered a very hip thing to do, to go watch that film. Linda was the center of attention. She was on Hugh Hefner's guest list, and she was America's first porn star. But she wasn't free. She was being trafficked by her pimp, whose name was Chuck Traynor. And her name wasn't Linda Lovelace, and she never chose to do this, and often was actually forced by gunpoint to do certain scenes. She finally escaped, and nobody believed her. Everyone had already become attached to the idea of Linda Lovelace and to the identity that had been formed by her popularity. Most tragic of all was that nobody believed her, and that people just discredited her. It's the porn business. It's not something that's considered reputable. Even if you enjoy partaking in it, it's not something that the general public will say, well, she's a reputable source, and they didn't. And then she published her biography, Ordeal, and she explained everything that happened, hardly made a blip on the radar. But this film, Lovelace, also was sort of a box office, did not succeed in the box office. But if you do watch it, it shows two sides of the story. It shows the side that everyone believed and the side as it actually happened, where she was very much coerced into this life. Sadly, she did go on to start a family of her own, but in 2002 she died in a car crash at age 53, still largely misunderstood by our culture. So you might think, well, since Linda Lovelace has written that story, why haven't people paid attention to it? Why haven't you heard about this in the news, that sex trafficking is very much linked to pornography, and that pictures of women in online pornography are strippers who people rent for bachelor parties, and these people are really not free. Why don't we hear this? Well, it's hard at first, as we all know, to combat something that's mainstream and accepted, and this is very accepted. But it's also, possible that it might not be popular to argue against this, because a lot of people are addicted to porn. I think that because of porn addictions, the fact that porn is has very addictive qualities, a lot of people have become attached to the thinking that it can't possibly be wrong. They don't really want to face the reality. One man who discussed this in a book published by written by Pamela Paul, called Pornified, some of you may have heard, in 2006. He said, quote, "I would see some young girl in porn and then read a horror story in the newspaper about sex trafficking in Eastern Europe, but I just mentally discarded the connection. I just couldn't let myself feel anything toward these women other than a means to satisfy my desires." He's just one of the many men who regularly watch porn online and whose interest in younger-looking girls increases the chance that he's looking at a minor, because any minor is a trafficked person in America. Anybody who's used for commercial sex purposes, who's under 18, is considered a trafficked person in the United States. So if you're looking at somebody who's 14, then it is by definition a trafficked person. And there's research that shows that routine porn consumption can affect men's brains by sort of rewiring how they work. A lot of us may have heard of this before. Norman Doidge, a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, described in his best-selling book, The Brain That Changes Itself, how those who use pornography have no sense of the extent to which their brains are reshaped by it. The addictiveness of internet porn is not a metaphor. Not all addictions are to drugs or alcohol. He continues, people can be seriously addicted to gambling, even to running. All addicts show a loss of control in the activity, compulsively seek it despite negative consequences, develop tolerance so that they need higher and higher levels of stimulation for satisfaction, and experience withdrawal if they can't consummate the addictive act. So in some ways, porn is more exciting than satisfying, he explains, because the pleasure systems in our brains make it such that porn viewers develop new maps in their brains based on the photos and videos they see. And he calls it a use it or lose it brain. When we develop a map area, we long to keep it activated. So this is just illustrating how this isn't an easy thing to tackle. This is really affecting people. It might explain why a man revealed to Pamela Paul that he grew interests he didn't previously have. Quote, "I was just looking around and I came across new things like child porn, generally agreed as a bad thing in this country. But after you've been exposed to certain things, the thing about porn is you want more and more extreme content." Well, this was true for this individual. He continues, "Though those child porn didn't become a particular interest of mine, I did get interested in young teen stuff." He's starting to rationalize that that's different from child porn if it's young teen. "Girls on spring break and that kind of thing. I would tell myself that the person was of age while I was looking at it, but I would question it afterward." End quote. With the accessibility, affordability, and anonymity, like the 3 A's of porn, accessibility, affordability, and anonymity of porn on the internet, the desire for more extreme content can be easily fed. As many develop desires for more and more extreme content, the girls look younger and younger, increases the chances that the porn is actually of a trafficked person. One man told Paul how he stumbled upon child porn itself. He said, it was scary because I was turned on and also because it obviously depicted kids who had been abused and tricked. You could tell they were stressed out in front of the camera." Sorry to tell you all this after your lunch. It's clearly not a light topic, but I think it's important that we acknowledge that, many people say child porn is very different from other forms of porn. We just draw a line. But the reality is, once you look closer, it's harder and harder to draw that line. One man, and then what you watch on the internet can also feed into your life in different ways. One such man, the Pamela Paul spoke with, described how he grew such an affinity for young girls online that he caught himself propositioning 15-year-olds on a family vacation. So porn can be a gateway to seeking out live prostitutes, many of whom are sex trafficked. And those can be found online. Now in the modern age of the internet, they're less and less on the streets. People think, oh, I don't see prostitutes on the streets. They're found online on Craigslist and Backpage.com. In addition to just a few clicks away, easily clickable, some places even show pornography that's live. And then you can, if it's in your city, go to that exact location and continue the pornography with a live person, one-on-one in the act of prostitution. So one man told, Victor Malik wrote a book called The Johns, and one man told him, "Many times in my life I started out watching porn, next thing I know, I'm in my car looking for the real thing." Malik sees a connection. He says, porn and Johns go hand in hand. Porn is often what turns men on, revs up their sex drive, and sends them out into the night. It's the poor cousin of prostitution, a man's surrogate for the kind of sex he craves but can't easily afford or get in life. So in addition to porn being a gateway for many men to seek prostitutes, there are many men who report both prostitution and pornography overlapping. One man was participating in sex tourism in Czech Republic and learned that he was filmed during the act of prostitution. So it actually his act became pornography in the overlap right there. Other places, like I said, you can have a live viewing of people being prostituted that actually becomes pornography. And since we're talking about addictions and how more and more extreme content can rewire men's brains, it's worth considering this, something that Caitlin mentioned, the recent film, Don John, of a porn addict. It shows a portrait of a porn addict at the, that is a good, actually, illustration of what it does, and it shows how depressing it is. He was just going nowhere in relationships. And he never stopped to consider the strange behavior he was partaking in. He was a very promiscuous individual. He would take women out, he'd take them home, and after every encounter, he'd have to go and log online and seek a woman in porn. And the truth is, that movie identified a real problem, how porn is actually affecting how we see sexual encounters in real life. For many people who are addicted to porn, are no longer as exciting. And so they have to continue going back to porn. So he says real sex can't compare to cyber sex anymore. Many men today become junkies to porn, sadly, making a daily habit. He's a perfect illustration of it. Daily habit of visiting porn sites, hiding it from their partners, and having trouble stopping. And those who try an exercise in self-control, as he does in the film, often cite feelings of withdrawal and increased difficulty. And like I said, as Julianne Moore aptly captures, they ultimately determine that, as she put it, so you like porn better than sex, which is a sad thing when we start to realize that what is porn? It's supposed to be some kind of hint at what sex is like, but it's more and more actually pointing very far away from what actual sex is like. And it sounds like what one real man told Pamela Paul: a man starts to feel like a computer himself when he realizes that he's dependent on computer images to turn him on. So for many men, this internet porn is a gateway to strip clubs, escort services, and prostitutes, real live women who are paid to continue this porn fantasy in their lives, to feign enjoyment and perform acts similar to those in porn. Norma Ramos, head of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, finds this a disturbing trend. She says, quote, "Porn is corrupting male sexuality by moving it in the direction to buy prostituted sex." She told me, "Johns are not born, they're made." And that's where the connections between porn and sex trafficking come full circle. Porn fuels men to buy sex from prostitutes. Trafficked people are an increasing number of those prostitutes because of the young ages that people are seeking. And it becomes like a gateway drug. One other activist told me porn is the PR arm of prostitution. Prostitution generally not accepted in this country, but porn a little more accepted. And the sad reality is prostitution, while we don't talk about it, while it's not probably considered more accepted to talk about, like pornography, is in fact a booming business in this country. It's hard to put numbers on it again, but if we know that there are 100,000 to 300,000 trafficked women that are being sold, there are many, many more consumers of those women. Who are these people? Who are the men who buy sex? What are their demographics? According to a report by Melissa Farley in 1986, a sample of 1,000 men in Norway found the demographic similarities, more demographic similarities than differences between men who buy sex than men who did not buy sex. There were no differences in age, occupation, or social status. So it's really like a random sample of Americans, of people who buy sex compared to those who don't. We might think, well, it's just maybe a lower, a more devastated part of the country maybe have this. No, it's all over the country. And it was borne out in my interviews with women who had been formerly prostituted against their will. When I asked Jessica Richardson, for example, she told me, it seems like all people, everybody were customers. She said, if you're walking the track, which was street prostitution, then you would encounter you'd encounter your laborers, your construction workers, your McDonald's workers, cheaper clients. But for escort services and hotels, you'd have your lawyers, your congressmen, your business CEOs. And the problem is, as she sees it, that buyers are those who make and enforce the laws. She really feels, and it's a common trend for these sex trafficking trafficked women to feel that nobody understands, and that the people who are buying are also the people who are continuing the laws that are going to be arresting the women for prostituting themselves. But in reality, it's not they who are acting on their own free will. So she says, she's had girls, now she does work with sex trafficking survivors, and she says she's known girls who've worked or who were trafficked by chief of police, who've had pastors as clients. There's no demographic free of this, she says. Another man, let's see, interviewed in Melissa Farley's study of men who buy sex, indicated a similar thought on the high numbers of consumers and the low likelihood of getting caught. The consumers are very, very unlikely to get caught, and so it's a real problem. She says, one of the people who was a consumer of prostitution, said, quote, "I wouldn't like to get caught, but I'll go on the lack of probability of getting caught. If I got caught, so would half of the male population," he says, end quote. There's also a large number of men in the military who buy sex. According to Melissa Farley's 2011 study, quote, 1 in 5 men in this sample had been in the armed forces, who were men who had told Melissa Farley that they had been consumers of sex. So that's just an idea of who these people are. It's hard to say, but Sean McGraw, a Dallas-based investigator for the Immigration and Customs Enforcement of the Department for Homeland Security, tells me that it just seems like an, quote, endless supply of Johns, endless amount of Johns. One occasion they put up a fake ad on Backpage.com, and in a very short amount of time received over 100 calls or texts from Johns soliciting sex from that ad. What does this tell us? It tells us that these people who are consumers, who are many of whom are using pornography, and it's leading them to then seek sex in real life from prostituted women, it is fueling the demand for trafficking. And so more and more groups and states and different task forces across the country are starting to reconsider the laws and rewrite their laws about who they're going to target. Is it going to be so much the women, or is it going to be more the consumers? And there's a trend changing to attack the demand, and that's something that's happening now. Where do men buy sex? A 2008 study of Chicago men who buy sex reveals that 52% of those who bought sex indoors purchased at a bar, 46% purchased it in a strip club, 36% via an escort agency. Just to clear out any misunderstanding, escort agencies are not dates. You know, there's a lot of naivete and things about, some people think that these are, dates for lonely people. It's basically prostitution. So strip clubs, these things that we consider acceptable, that we think are, women who just choose to work and get some money, and they choose to do it through stripping. So who's to criticize that? If it were their free choice, it might be one thing, but it's, for many women, not their free choice. Do the men know that these women are trafficked? Sadly, many of them do. Maybe they aren't thinking about that, but many, you would know that they're trafficked if they were younger than 18. Many men in interviews identify that they know that the women that they've either seen sold or have seen in pornography are under 18, so they know those are trafficked people. Or they'll see signs of trafficking, they'll see signs of abuse, or they'll see the pimp, and they'll know, therefore, that it's trafficking. Or sometimes, sadly, the most tragically perhaps, the woman will tell them. I've read interviews that show women who tell the buyer, "I'm trafficked, I'm trying to escape." The man doesn't believe her or just doesn't act. And so it's really sad. I've had one woman tell me that she bawled and that he knew, and she told him. And the buyer, doesn't act. So the consumers are not acting rationally. They are consumed, so to speak, with desires that have been largely shaped for them, with desires that they feel they can't control, but perhaps desires shaped that have affected their brains through porn. How does this affect us in the greater society? Well, obviously it affects the women and children and some men, not many, but who are trafficked. The women who aren't seeing the money, they are lured into being trafficked by force, fraud, or coercion, often as children, often previously abused. It's not a free choice at all. Many people like to suggest it is. There was an article in February of this year from Reason magazine, where a writer says that, she's calling for sex worker rights. Something we've probably heard, sex workers. We need to help sex workers. Sex workers are people who choose to be in this line of work. She says that any groups that are she actually names groups that are leading against sex trafficking, but she says that their work is a specter to shame women and restrict their rights. She says she says they're just trying to prohibit, it's like making it sound like they're prohibition of porn and prostitution, and trying to keep women from exercising a choice to work in the field if they'd like to. But curious, I showed that article to 2 women who had escaped the life of sex trafficking, and I wanted to know what they thought. And she said, one of them was drawn to this line in the article where it says, quotes, an anti-porn feminist, Melissa Farley, who I've mentioned her studies, she's said, quote, prostitution is paid rape. Prostitution is paid rape, these girls exclaimed, and at the same time, they almost were like, how can anyone doubt that? Well, the reality is not many people think of it that way, but prostitution, what is it? It's sex that with a woman who would say no to you unless you paid her, so that no turns to a yes with the exchange of money. It's paid rape. Even if those women were choosing to do it for money independently, which many of them aren't even getting the money. So the money is going to often the traffickers, and the women are just plain raped. But one of the girls zeroed in on that phrase and said, look at the numbers. Every one of these sex workers was exploited as a child. And it took me a moment to realize what she was saying. If many women find themselves in sex work and were exploited as minors, then you could say, as Tina Front of Courtney's House said, quote, I never knew what consensual sex was. Then it would be disingenuous to call their sex work a free choice. Jessica Richardson even said to me, I would have argued anyone to death about the empowering nature of sex work while she was in it. She says, it felt empowering, but was it? Absolutely not. She says, it was the most degrading work in the world. How are you supposed to get out? So, I call these women sex trafficking survivors, and many people in the field call them survivors. I know that's a term that has a little bit of weight attached to it. Some people say you should only call someone a survivor if they actually would have died, if it's very common that they would face death. And sometimes it's an overused phrase, like, I'm a survivor of, I don't know, a class, or like survivor of things that wouldn't actually mean that you would be risking your life. The Titanic had some survivors because there were a lot of people who died. But I do think that's an okay phrase to use, and the reason is because many women do die or don't make out alive, make it out alive from this lifestyle. One woman, Annie Lobert, was a formerly trafficked woman I spoke with in Las Vegas. She started an anti-prostitution group called Hookers for Jesus. She's not a current hooker, but she thinks that name speaks to women and the women who are currently in that life to feel that Jesus loves them. Anyway, she was being trafficked, and her pimp one day just got to a point, got angry with her, and threw her in the trunk of a car, and there was a shovel in the car. Just a few weeks prior, she says one of her friends had died and disappeared. She knows she was going to die, and she actually started to sing. She started to sing. She was a little, out of it. At this point, you think you're about to be killed. She started to sing, I know Jesus, or this I know, Jesus loves me because the Bible tells me so. And it just apparently freaked out her pimp, and he just let her out, and she escaped. But the reality is, so that's a side note. If anybody needs to have a escape route, start singing about Jesus, and it might happen. But the reality is, it is a dangerous, very dangerous field. I mean, everybody, you don't have to watch much of CSI or whatnot, like to see sex stripping, sex trafficking, prostitution. These things are filled with abuse. It's a very big stereotype. These women are not treated well, and many of them die. So I'm also at a conference by Shared Hope International. Somebody said, what? I'd like to call these women overcomers because they've overcome so much. And I've met a lot of these women, and they are so strong. They've overcome. It takes a lot of time, a lot of therapy, a lot of help, a lot of services for them to get out of the thinking that they were entrenched in. But they are very strong and help to lead against this problem now and help in their communities. And so I do think that's a good phrase. Survivor is very apt word to call it. And children, Taryn Malstreen of Shared Hope told me that if we don't combat this problem, and trafficking is taking place in a certain location and buyers are supporting it, we are paying with our children. It might be hard to see how this affects us in society, but we all have siblings or cousins or neighbors, and these people are affected. While it's not exactly a case of trafficking for money, think of the case of Amanda Berry. It was news not long ago. Amanda Berry and 2 other girls were entrapped in the house in Cleveland by a man who, in his final testimony before he killed himself in jail, a man, Ariel Castro, said, quote, I don't have the exact quote, but he was blaming his porn addiction on his compulsion to enslave these girls. Those girls, I'm from Cleveland. We're from a neighborhood it's not the worst neighborhood in Cleveland. So these people, this affects all of us in a way because it's affecting children and young people. And those are a part of our communities. So we all have an obligation to combat this as much as we can and to help identify the problem. How else does it affect the society? Obviously, it affects the economy. It's a black market, and it's a very lucrative one. Unlike the black market of drugs or weapons, those cost money for people to gain, and then they sell. Kidnapping women doesn't cost money, so it's very lucrative, and it's very much under the radar. And then thirdly, how does it affect you and me? It affects relationships. That's something that the movie Don John did capture. I don't recommend watching it if you don't want to see a lot of porn-like clips. I don't know to recommend it to many people. It depends on where you are and what you think. But I think for the mainstream accepting culture of porn, it was a good message against it. It affects relationships. The whole point is once sex is treated as no longer a relationship between 2 people, it turns people into objects. One man who had spent a lot of time buying prostitutes ended up changing his mind. He said, quote, "I wouldn't encourage prostitution. It's someone's mother or daughter. It's an empty experience. It sounds enjoyable at the beginning, but it's just horrible and degrading." One interviewee for one of Melissa Farley's studies said something similar. He said, "It can be very satisfying at the moment, but inevitably leads to a lot of stress and anxiety. I'm supporting an industry that is exploitative and unfair and potentially harmful to myself and all parties involved. They're getting paid for it, but you are being a patron to an industry that is very dangerous." So it affects these people, but also by objectifying them. And these men these men interviewed, realized that it did affect them to objectify people. And that's a problem that affects all of us. It may seem like it doesn't affect you still. So let me add, Gail Dines mentioned this woman who works at Wheelock College in Boston, does a lot of work against porn. Her book, Pornland, was a very good one. She says, all men are going to be affected by the sex industry, but we can't be sure how it will manifest itself. How it affects men depends on a whole slew of characteristics, and they're hard to measure. For some it will lead to rape. For some it will lead to nagging their girlfriends into rougher sex, and so on. For some it will lead to porn-like sex and struggles having intimacy and connection in the relationships. But whatever the effects, there's one thing for certain about the experiences of using women in prostitution or porn. These arousing experiences have a profound effect on the mind and body of the viewer. So Gail Dines goes on to say it affects all of our relationships. She says, to date these men whose sexual templates have been designed by porn, is a disaster. These women can't find dates, and when they do, the men just want to F them. So we're looking at the hookup culture, she says. Porn is sex in real life. She says, quote, no connection, no commitment, no pleasure for the woman. Instead, the feeling of sexual satisfaction, instead of that sexual satisfaction after their encounter, she tells me, college girls describe what they call an emotional hangover. And for her, it's no surprise that studies indicate that women are more depressed, anxious, and more miserable than those in past decades. Sound familiar to activity on college campuses today? It sort of she brings home how this affects us, because porn is so mainstream. So even if we're not talking about people who intentionally go out there and buy prostituted women, it's affecting our relationships in this country. The truth is, commercial sex objectifies both parties, the sellers as well. The sellers, the women selling sex, those are dehumanized. We know that the women and the traffickers they're dehumanizing the women. Those women are mistreated and abused, but also the buyers are objectified. They're treated just as money. They're treated as dollar bills by the pimps. They're treated as suckers. They have a weakness and they're exploited for that weakness. Once people are treated as things, and sex as a self-centered experience rather than a two-person relation, there we have the justification for the sex trade. We also have the ingredients for the hookup culture and the other ripples of thinking of sex for personal gain, this thinking, and the disregard for the personhood of the other. As Don John put it, when he was describing in a sweet scene, it was meant to be sweet, but if you think about it, what his words are saying are objectifying. He says to Scarlett Johansson, "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." And so if we want authentic relationships, we have to stop treating people, try to combat this culture of treating people as things, and even resist the temptation to treat ourselves as things to get others' attention. What else can we do to combat this? We need to not support the sex industry in any way, not hire a stripper for a bachelor party. If people are doing that, to verbally say that you're against it and why. To not use porn, and if it's already something that you've gotten in the habit of, to get a filter if you need to. There's a good one I've heard called K9. But just basic, and there are support groups too. Gail Dines went into what's the most, for men who are trying to stop these habits, she says there aren't many support groups. It's not very accepted. Therapy for it is made fun of across the industry of psychology, but they exist. But also Christian groups. She said she's not Christian, but she was sort of, how do these groups work? She didn't fully understand, but she knows that a lot of men describe that these support groups among religions have been more effective. I urge you to get involved if you want to know how to help with Polaris, with Shared Hope, different groups in your communities. There are a lot of community-based groups that help sex trafficking survivors. Another way you can help is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's alerts. Often you'll see young people in their teens. These women are in great number abused sexually and in the commercial sex industry. There's a national hotline by Polaris. I highly recommend you put it in your phones, look it up and get it on your phones. And if you see somebody or you see something that looks fishy, then you can give a tip. Have a survivor come speak in your schools, a sexual trafficking survivor. If there's a sex week at your school, have some counter events that bring attention to this problem. Most of all, I know this is very dark, but don't despair. This isn't a light talk, but remember, we're putting a price on sex, cheapens it, and that's why often one needs more and more of it shortly after. It doesn't satisfy, it's cheapening sex. But real authentic relational sex is still more powerful. There's some movies that capture this, like I mentioned Don John does, but also that film, I don't know, many of you, I won't recommend it either, Zach and Miri Make a Porno from a few years ago. The end little message is the two of them actually found love, and real love was more powerful than the previous pornographic sex scenes. There's still, that's capturing, even in these pop culture references, how real, authentic, now granted they weren't married and this wasn't real love, but still it's hinting toward the truth that real, authentic relational sex is more powerful. And as Julianne Moore said in Don John, if you want to lose yourself, you have to lose yourself in another person. And she has to lose herself in you. It's a two-way thing. And that'll always be more powerful than a one-way thing. Roger Scruton, I highly recommend, for those of you who want more information on the cost of pornography, The Social Cost of Pornography, a 2010 book that came out of a conference actually here at Princeton. And Roger Scruton spoke at that conference, and this phrase that he said, this remark that he said still really hits me. Psychologists and psychotherapists are increasingly encountering the damage done by pornography, not to marriages and relationships only, but to the very capacity to engage in them. This, it seems to me, is the real risk attached to pornography. Those who become addicted to this risk-free form of sex risk another and greater kind, a risk of a greater kind. They risk the loss of love in a world where only love brings happiness. So yes, real, authentic, relational, loving sex is still more powerful than what's out there in porn. It's more difficult to foster. It's not as easy as making an online purchase. It takes more time and commitment. It's not instant gratification. It's fruitful and life-giving, not destructive. And it's intimately connected with the stuff of love and fidelity, the most rare and beautiful thing in the world. So that's why I applaud all of you for coming and for continuing those messages in your schools and in your work and in your life, because those are the things that are more powerful. And it's maybe less popular, but it'll win out in the end. And in our individual lives, we can make a difference. So I'm happy to take questions. So you're asking, how can we support those who are combating this? And also, how do we praise those who are living in a more appreciative woman? I think it's important that we do those things. I think men do need to support. I mean, I think when I look at the size of this problem and how addictive pornography and these behaviors are, and how this really does affect men, and I see how it is, we do need to continue to treat them as humans as well, and not just demonize them. And so we all need to keep that perspective. And different ways I would say it's just in a personal, like relational way, through relationships. Give where we can encouragement and to praise those who do practice fidelity and don't encourage support of these industries. Yes? That question was, how can the laws be more, better combat the problem? Yeah, so some groups are focusing on that. One of them is Shared Hope International. They actually look at every state and grade their laws and their system and how they combat the problem and critique them and offer suggestions. I recommend them, and Polaris as well. But among the studies that asked people, men, what would deter them the most from buying, and many people are focusing on this side, as I mentioned, the demand side, rather than just still trying to nail the traffickers. They're very good at being hidden, and that's why it's a black market. So if we nail the demand side, many men have said that if they were put on some sex registry list, that would affect them. And so that's one way that can be considered to really combat that demand problem that some states might be considering. I don't have as much information on that, but it's very true. And we know that men and women are different. And one way that women are more interested in pornography, I've learned, is in written pornography, because they're not as visual, perhaps, it's more in your imagination. But but there also is visual female pornography. But then there's also mainstream kinds like Shades of Grey. Shades of Grey, so sad. Gail Dines told me, the main character of Shades of Grey was Christian Grey. He's a sadist. He abused this woman and manipulated her mentally. But it's treated as a loving story, as a sweet, attractive, it's packaged nicely and recommended by people on television. So, but the reality is, she said she's met Christian Greys, and she's met the woman who've been battered by Christian Greys. It's not a beautiful story. That's what Gail Dines told me. Yes? I recommend a book by Dorchen Leithold. She combats this, she answers this question in a good book called Sexual Liberationism and Radical Feminism. I might not have captured the full title there, but if you Google it, you'll find it. I think she captures there, within feminism, why there's a little bit of discord, but there are feminists who are very anti-porn, like Gloria Steinem, Andrea Dworkin, other women very much working against this in feminist groups like Equality Now is working against this. And there are a lot of, and Dorchen Leithold, like I said, and Norma Ramos. But these feminists, they're not very popular anymore for those beliefs. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but the general trends are that they are previously abused, but it's less and less just from an economic bracket. It's also just from all range. It's basically, the problem is this: every young woman at some point, and even young men, are vulnerable. And when you're a child, that's the reason that children can get lured into this. You don't have to have, as a child, you're more vulnerable to trusting adults. And so it really is more across the board than not, because we all have a moment of being a vulnerable child. Maybe one more question, then we have to, yes? Stockholm Syndrome is when it's like the often decried problem of when a tortured person or a manipulated person is hard to separate from their abuser. And that's what happens, the police will try to save them, and then they'll often return to their abuser. And that's what's happening often that's why it's difficult for the law enforcement right now. But they have teamed up with women's organizations that help them to talk to the women. Often they'll actually outsource that part of the work of the social services to these women who've survived trafficking to talk to the women who are currently being trafficked, because they know how to tap into to just break through the barriers of the very, very strong manipulation that has taken place. So I think we do have to end now. I'm getting signals that the next talk is going to start in 10 minutes. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you to Love and Fidelity.